The next three chapters of Luke, chapters 7, which we're on today, 8 and 9, are all underneath a theme. Luke is portraying Jesus as more than a prophet. That's important to distinguish that difference, because it was an attitude that most people would have had about any kind of new leader in Israel, that they were another prophet in a long line of prophets. Luke's going to begin establishing here today that Jesus is more than a prophet, but he'll also begin to put some underpinnings there, some definitions of what that means. What does being more than a prophet mean? Because it was a question then, and it's a question oftentimes now. The very first sentence of chapter 7 is a literary transition. Luke's a really fine writer, so he's got to have a little separation there between where he was in chapter 6 and where he's going here. It's a literary transition. The Sermon on the Plain, which we talked about last week, is over. And now Jesus is making a geographical move to Capernaum. After Jesus had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. A centurion there had a slave whom he valued highly and who was ill and close to death. When he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to him, asking him to come and heal his slave. When they came to Jesus, they appealed to him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy of having you do this for him, for he loves our people, and it is he who built our synagogue for us." And Jesus went with them, but when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you, but only speak the word, and let my servant be healed. For I also am a man under authority, with soldiers under me, 100 of them at least. And I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my slave, 'Do this,' and the slave does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him. And turning to the crowd that followed him, he said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. Centurion century, there would have been 100 leaders, if not only 100 soldiers underneath him. Yet he's also a friend of the Jews. Remember now, Luke's writing about 40 years after Jesus was on the cross. A church has been established now, so these kinds of stories are important because the centurion is Gentile, and there are other Gentiles, sometimes secretly, sometimes openly, beginning to follow apostles and disciples and teachers on the way of Jesus. This centurion has never had direct contact with Jesus. He represents for Luke all those people who have not seen Jesus, but who believe in his presence through the power of his words. Luke's saying that this is a valid faith. It's why he chooses to highlight this story. It's a valid faith, and that's important to us, to those of us who are of another time and place, and we're not in that position of the apostles and disciples to have actually seen Jesus and been with him. The centurion is a Gentile. He's a non-Jew. The ministry of Jesus is opening a whole new door here, one which most of the world, and us too, were on the other side of. And as evidenced from the story, his word here has the power to heal. Continuing in verse 11. Soon afterwards he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow, and with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized all of them, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably upon his people." This word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country. Compassion. In the Sermon on the Plain, which Jesus had given several days before, among the blessings he gave were, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." The entire focus on this little scene is on the mother, compassion toward the mother. He demonstrates the power of his words by stopping what he was doing and going to this little procession coming out, going to the mother. His word has the power here to raise the dead. But most importantly, these two little stories are a prelude to the next one. John the Baptist is now in prison, although Luke never mentions that fact. He's in prison because he dared to say that King Herod was a sinner, and he was put into prison for that and eventually executed for doing that. He has a question here for Jesus, though. His question is brought to Jesus by John's disciples. It's a question born of the expectation of what Israel's Messiah would be like. Verse 18, the disciples of John reported all these things to him, reports of these healings, this raising of the dead which had taken place. So John summoned two of his disciples and sent them to the Lord to ask, "Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another?" When the men had come to him, they said, "John the Baptist has sent us to you to ask, 'Are you the one who is to come, or are we to wait for another?'" Jesus had just then cured many people of diseases, plagues, and evil spirits, and had given sight to many who were blind. And he answered them, "Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news brought to them, and blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me." John, like the prophets before him many centuries before, had preached that the coming Messiah would come at a time and inaugurate and begin a time of great change. The day of the Lord, Amos and other prophets called it. For Amos and some of the other prophets, it was a dark day of doom when God's wrath would fall on the people. For others, Isaiah and others, it was a day of light in which great hope would flood the nation. But they all agreed that this would be a monumental change in everything, that everything would change. It was a time when they said God would turn the world upside down with a new order, and with not a little bit of vengeance as well. "Prepare the way of the Lord," John had preached in the wilderness. So are you the one, Jesus? Or should we wait for somebody else? All John had to go on were the stories coming back to him about Jesus, which is just like us. That's what we have to go on now, 2,000 years later, are the stories about Jesus. Not only those told in the Gospels, but those that have been related in tradition and through time. The stories about Jesus come first, of course. Then come personal belief in Christ. Then conversion, then a life of following Christ. So John's questions are not out of the ordinary. Jesus is not lining up exactly with what John expected. It's not that he's doubting Jesus' power, but he's wondering about Jesus' role as Messiah. And that's the same kind of question that we, if we are honest, ask ourselves about sometimes, maybe oftentimes. Did the stories we've heard or are hearing about Jesus lead us to have certain expectations about what following Jesus would mean for our lives? Did we expect to soon be following Jesus into a revolution of sorts, overturning the old ways and ushering in a new age of humankind, a new world? Did we expect from the stories we heard that we would see or be people that were miraculously cured of terminal diseases or even raised from the dead? Jesus' answer then turns out to be not an answer at all, but a blessing. And we need to hear Jesus' response too, because we all ask these questions in one form or another sometimes, and as I said before, maybe very often. In fact, you know that I believe that doubt is where faith has a chance to grow. If you have no doubt about Jesus, then you've probably not been asking any questions, not learning, not bothered learning, not needing to learn anything new, not wanting to hear anything about Jesus other than what you learned in Sunday school when you were a kid or at a Billy Graham crusade when you were 30. If we don't make room through doubt for our faith to grow, we will not experience conversion. We might experience memorization and learn to repeat words from the Bible, but that's not conversion. We might experience argumentation with anyone who brings new information to us about Jesus, new insight, but that's not conversion either. We might even experience militarization and be ready to fight, even kill those who would dare to question or disturb the vulnerable, veneer-thin faith we wear across our shoulders like a shawl of pride. But that certainly is not conversion. What is conversion? The best conversion story I know, I think I've mentioned this before, the best conversion story I know is the summary by Anne Lamott on page 50 of her book, Traveling Mercies, but I can't even repeat it here. Remember that though, write it down, page 50, Anne Lamott, Traveling Mercies, and find it and read it yourself. But conversion is about not stopping with the stories of others about Jesus. Not stopping with the stories about Jesus that you heard from grandma or your second grade Sunday school teacher or a preacher you loved or from some preacher on TV with the $1,500 Armani suit and a new Bentley to join his collection in the front driveway. It means not even stopping with the stories from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It does mean using all of those stories as windows and doorways to the light on the other side of them. It means self-examining in that light. What is stopping me from opening those windows higher or those doors wider? Is it the can of Bud in my hand? Is it regrets about all the yesterdays so far? Is it fear of disturbing the status quo of tomorrow? Because conversion means change. In lifestyles sometimes, in attitude all the time. Conversion is about no longer feeling silly, weak, or stupid when you fall in love, when you fall in compassion with a stranger on the street. Conversion means jumping from the words about Jesus, from wherever you are safely reading or listening to them, into the abyss of not knowing for sure what I'm doing, but I know God is with me. I am never alone. Thanks be to God. Conversion is hearing Jesus whisper, maybe in the middle of the night, there is another way. I'm closer than a brother. Follow me. Conversion is not digging lines in the sand and shouting, I'm right. It's stepping over the line yourself and saying to the other, I'm sorry, or I forgive you, or let's go eat something together. Blessed is anyone who takes no offense at me, Jesus said. In other words, don't be offended. If Jesus isn't doing your personal bidding, he's not a hand puppet connected to all our preconceived notions. He's the Spirit of truth in us. He's the light of the world on us. He is the Messiah ahead of us, beside us, with us, to the end of the world, Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. So don't stop somewhere in the middle. There's more to see, more to do, and much, much more to be. Amen.